The brutal reality of Roman soldiers who came home broken. The rain had stopped just before dawn. Somewhere beyond the hills of central Italy, a rooster cried into the cold gray air, and a veteran of Rome woke up screaming again. Not because enemies were at the gate. Not because Hannibal himself had crossed another mountain with elephants and bad intentions. No, this battle had ended years ago. The armor was gone. The marching boots had rotted away in some forgotten campaign. The empire had moved on to newer wars, newer heroes, newer corpses. But the old soldier still woke with blood in his mouth that wasn't there. And in the darkness of his small farmhouse, while his wife pretended not to hear him trembling beside her, Rome quietly forgot the man who had once carried her banners across the world. That is where our story begins tonight. Not with glorious triumphs or golden emperors or marble statues standing heroically against the sunset. We've heard enough about those men already. History loves polished bronze and victory parades. It loves commanders pointing dramatically toward distant horizons while orchestras swell in the background. The Roman Empire practically invented propaganda. They would have absolutely loved modern movie trailers. But this story is about the men underneath the armor, the exhausted legionaries who came home broken, the men who survived the wars only to discover that survival itself had become the punishment. And Rome produced a lot of them. For centuries, Roman soldiers marched across deserts, forests, mountains, and frozen frontiers. They conquered kingdoms, slaughtered tribes, burned cities, enslaved millions, and built an empire so enormous that even Romans struggled to understand how absurdly large it had become. A soldier could leave Italy as a teenager and spend 20 years fighting in places his parents had never even heard of. Gaul, Germania, Judea, Britannia, Dacia, Syria. Names whispered like storms. And Rome demanded everything from these men. Their youth, their bodies, their sanity, sometimes even their names. Because the Roman military machine was not designed to care whether a soldier returned whole. It was designed to win. And if a few 100,000 minds cracked along the way, well, there were always more recruits. As always with Rome, the reality was messier than the statues suggested. So tonight, we are going to walk slowly through the lives of Roman soldiers after the glory faded. We are going to sit beside them in muddy camps and broken villages. We are going to follow them home from endless wars and watch what happened when the cheering stopped. And the strangest part is this: many of them feared peace more than battle. Because war, at least, made sense. Peace required remembering. The Roman Republic in its earlier centuries liked to imagine itself as a society of sturdy farmer soldiers. Citizens who tilled fields in spring, marched to war in summer, and returned home in time for harvest. Simple, noble, efficient, like a patriotic advertisement carved into marble. The reality, naturally, was chaos. Early Roman warfare was brutal but relatively seasonal. Campaigns were shorter. Soldiers often remained close to home. Even then, though, war left marks that nobody had words for. Ancient societies rarely discussed psychological trauma openly, but traces leak through the cracks of history like smoke under a door. Roman writers described veterans haunted by panic, sudden rages, sleeplessness, trembling, emotional numbness, and terrifying dreams. They simply interpreted these symptoms differently. Sometimes as cowardice, sometimes as divine punishment, sometimes as weakness of character. Because ancient civilizations were remarkably good at understanding suffering, while simultaneously being terrible at helping people survive it. And Rome was especially skilled at this contradiction. As the Republic expanded during the Punic Wars, everything changed. Suddenly Rome was no longer fighting neighboring rivals for local dominance. Now it was fighting gigantic conflicts that swallowed generations whole. Imagine being 19 years old and sent to Spain during the Second Punic War. You arrive expecting glory. Instead you find mud, disease, cold rains soaking through wool cloaks, rotting bodies hanging from trees, horses screaming in the night after ambushes, entire patrols vanishing into forests without a sound. And somewhere out there is Hannibal, the boogeyman of Roman history. A commander so dangerous that Roman mothers probably used him to terrify children into obedience. Finish your vegetables, or Hannibal will cross the Alps again. Roman soldiers watched entire armies disappear against him. At battles like Cannae, the slaughter became almost industrial in scale. Tens of thousands of Romans died in a single day beneath suffocating heat and crushing terror. Ancient accounts describe men packed so tightly together they could barely lift their weapons. Imagine the smell: sweat, blood, open intestines steaming under the Italian sun. Then, imagine surviving it. History often focuses on the dead because the dead are easier to count. But survivors carry wars forward inside themselves. A Roman soldier who escaped Cannae returned to a city drowning in grief and paranoia. Citizens feared invasion. Families searched desperately for missing sons. Politicians screamed accusations at each other. Temples filled with terrified prayers. And the survivors? Many were disgraced simply for living. Rome had an uncomfortable relationship with military defeat, especially psychological defeat. Soldiers who survived catastrophic battles were often treated with suspicion or contempt. Some units were exiled to distant postings for years as punishment for failure, because apparently surviving mass slaughter was not considered stressful enough. Roman culture worshipped endurance, discipline, masculine control. The ideal soldier was supposed to absorb horror without complaint, like a stone pillar wearing sandals. But human minds are not marble. A legionary could watch his closest friend disemboweled beside him, and still be expected to stand perfectly still in formation moments later. No crying, no hesitation, no panic. If he broke rank, centurions carried vine staffs, specifically for beating soldiers back into line. Imagine the emotional mathematics required to survive that environment. You learn quickly that fear must be buried alive, and buried fear has a habit of returning later. By the late Republic, Rome's wars became longer, larger, and vastly more personal. Generals like Marius transformed the military system entirely. Poor citizens now joined the army not merely out of civic duty, but because military service offered survival itself. Pay, loot, land promises, maybe even food tomorrow. The army stopped being a temporary obligation. It became life. And this changed everything psychologically. A Roman legionary no longer fought beside neighbors for a single campaign season. He spent decades marching with the same men through landscapes of continuous violence. The legion became family, identity, religion, and prison all at once. When modern historians discuss military trauma, one recurring truth appears again and again. Soldiers adapt to war frighteningly well. Too well. Humans normalize almost anything. A legionary stationed on the German frontier might spend years surrounded by danger so constant that his nervous system permanently recalibrated itself. Every rustle in the forest could signal attack. Every night watch might become his last. Winter froze fingers black. Summer brought disease clouds from swamps. Raids erupted without warning. Eventually, hypervigilance stopped being temporary. It became survival. And then Rome expected these men to go home and become peaceful farmers again. As if 20 years of violence could simply be washed off in a river somewhere. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars provide one of the clearest windows into this transformation. Caesar's soldiers marched through unimaginable brutality for nearly a decade. They slaughtered tribes by the tens of thousands. Entire communities vanished beneath Roman expansion. At Alesia, Roman troops built massive fortifications while trapped between two enemy armies. Hunger, exhaustion, terror, constant combat. Men lived for months inside a machine, fueled entirely by adrenaline and obedience. And Caesar loved them for it. Well, Loved is perhaps too sentimental. Caesar valued his soldiers because they were effective. He knew their names, shared hardships strategically, rewarded loyalty, gave stirring speeches, classic charismatic warlord behavior. His men became fiercely devoted to him precisely because war had erased everything else. Many veterans returning from Caesar's campaigns found Italy transformed. Farms lost, debts accumulated, political violence erupting everywhere. The Republic itself collapsing into civil war. Home no longer existed in the way they remembered. And psychologically, neither did they. Civil wars are uniquely destructive because they corrupt identity itself. Roman soldiers now killed fellow Romans. Men who spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, wore the same armor. The old boundaries dissolved. At battles like Pharsalus or Philippi, legionaries hacked apart citizens who might once have shared wine with them years earlier. Ancient historians occasionally describe soldiers recognizing former comrades during combat. Imagine that moment. A familiar face beneath the helmet. Then the spear thrust anyway. Because orders were orders. Because hesitation meant death. Because the machine had already consumed too much to stop now. Veterans of these civil wars carried unbearable contradictions home with them. Rome celebrated victory publicly, while privately drowning in trauma. Whole generations had spent their prime years inside continuous bloodshed. And Augustus, Rome's first emperor, understood something terrifying. Traumatized soldiers were politically dangerous. Very dangerous. A veteran legionary was trained for violence, accustomed to obedience, emotionally detached from civilian life, and often financially desperate. Basically the exact recipe for future unrest. So Augustus attempted something revolutionary: controlled retirement. Veterans received land settlements across the empire. Colonies were established specifically for discharged soldiers. In theory, this rewarded service while stabilizing society. In practice, it often created entirely new problems. Imagine a hardened veteran from Syria suddenly dumped into rural Gaul with a land grant and vague instructions to become peaceful. He barely speaks the local language. He has spent 20 years solving problems through violence. Half his friends are dead. His body aches constantly. Sleep comes in fragments interrupted by nightmares. And Rome says, "Congratulations on retirement. Enjoy farming." The transition could be catastrophic. Roman literature quietly hints at veterans struggling with alienation and emotional instability. Some became local bullies or enforcers. Others drifted into alcoholism. Many re-enlisted because civilian life felt unbearably empty. War had simplified existence. You woke, you marched, you obeyed. You survived another day. Civilian life demanded emotional complexity again. Families expected affection. Communities expected restraint. Farmers worried about taxes and weather instead of ambushes and arrows. After years of military structure, freedom itself could feel disorienting. And beneath everything lurked memory. Roman soldiers saw horrors modern audiences often underestimate, because ancient warfare is frequently romanticized. Films show clean sword fights between muscular heroes. Real combat was intimate butchery. Close enough to smell another man's breath. Close enough to hear lungs collapsing. Roman tactics depended heavily on relentless coordinated killing. Legionaries stabbed repeatedly into dense formations. After battles, survivors walked among mutilated corpses searching for friends. Limbs scattered in mud. Flies everywhere. Water contaminated with blood. Then camp had to be built before nightfall. No time for emotional processing. Just work. Always work. Ancient medicine could save some wounds, but many veterans returned permanently damaged. Missing fingers, crushed knees, blind eyes, infected scars, chronic pain from old fractures, malnutrition, parasites, lung damage from campfire smoke and battlefield dust. and those were merely the visible injuries. Psychological wounds remained unnamed, but omnipresent. The Roman historian Livy occasionally described soldiers becoming strangely detached after combat. Some laughed hysterically during disasters, others froze entirely. Some wandered battlefields in shock, calling for dead companions. Today we would recognize many symptoms immediately. Rome mostly called it weakness, or fate, or unfortunate temperament. Because ancient societies lacked both modern psychology and modern compassion regarding mental illness. A veteran experiencing trauma-induced panic might simply be mocked as cowardly. Depression could be interpreted as laziness. Emotional numbness might pass unnoticed entirely because Roman masculinity already demanded stoicism. The empire effectively built millions of traumatized men while possessing almost no language to describe what it had done to them. Which honestly feels disturbingly familiar. By the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Roman Empire reached its territorial peak. This period is often portrayed as the Pax Romana, the Great Roman Peace. An interesting name, considering the peace relied on endless military occupation across 3 continents. Somewhere along the Danube frontier, soldiers froze in isolated forts while watching barbarian movements through winter fog. In Britain, legionaries stood guard beneath cold rain so constant it probably entered their souls permanently. In Judea, troops navigated insurgencies and brutal urban tensions. In North Africa, men marched through scorching deserts that seemed designed specifically to punish human ambition. The empire looked stable from Rome. From the frontier, it looked exhausting. Roman soldiers served incredibly long terms, often 20 to 25 years. Imagine entering military service as a teenager and leaving as an old man by ancient standards. Most veterans had no memory of adult civilian life. The army raised them emotionally, and the Roman military system intentionally reshaped identity. Recruits endured harsh discipline from the beginning. Punishments could be savage, flogging, execution, decimation in extreme cases, where soldiers were forced to kill every 10th man among their own ranks. Nothing says team-building exercise quite like ritualized group murder. Fear bonded units together as effectively as loyalty. But prolonged exposure to violence changes perception itself. Ancient writers occasionally describe veterans struggling to reconnect emotionally after service. Some became intensely superstitious, others withdrew socially. Many carried profound fatalism. Death had become too ordinary. The Roman satirist Juvenal mocked soldiers returning home with arrogance and brutality. Veterans often intimidated civilians because they knew violence worked. After decades inside military hierarchy, ordinary social rules could feel irrelevant. And honestly, civilians feared them for good reason. A retired legionary was one of the most dangerous individuals in the ancient world. Highly trained, emotionally hardened, often armed, frequently disconnected from local communities. Yet beneath that intimidating exterior, there was often emptiness. One of the saddest realities about Roman veterans is how many simply vanished from history. Emperors left monuments, generals left biographies. Ordinary soldiers disappeared into silence unless they committed crimes or died spectacularly. Occasionally, though, archaeology whispers fragments back to us. A gravestone in northern England commemorates a cavalryman who served 26 years far from home. Another inscription records a veteran who died shortly after retirement. Tiny traces survive, names carved into stone by families or comrades who wanted someone to remember. Because Rome itself rarely paused to mourn individual suffering, the machine kept moving. Always another frontier. Always another war. And some soldiers never psychologically left the battlefield at all. Roman medical texts occasionally mention veterans suffering trembling fits, irrational fears, or sudden collapses under stress. Ancient doctors proposed explanations involving bodily humors, heat imbalance, divine displeasure, or exhaustion. No one considered that the human brain might fracture under prolonged horror, but the evidence surrounds us anyway. Take the Batavian Revolt in the 1st century AD. Roman forces fighting brutal campaigns in Germania experienced enormous stress under terrifying conditions. Dense forests, ambush warfare, constant uncertainty. Tacitus described soldiers consumed by fear and confusion during some operations. The Germanic wilderness itself became psychologically threatening in Roman imagination. Dark forests represented chaos beyond imperial control. Soldiers stationed there often lived under relentless tension for years. And when they returned home? How do you explain to civilians what prolonged fear feels like? How do you describe waking instantly at tiny sounds because your nervous system no longer trusts silence? Ancient veterans probably struggled with exactly the same emotional isolation modern veterans describe. The sense that ordinary people could not possibly understand. And maybe they couldn't. A Roman civilian in southern Italy might spend life worrying about harvests and taxes. A returning soldier had watched villages burn and friends bleed out screaming beneath foreign skies. Their realities no longer matched. This emotional gap widened further during the empire's later centuries as crises multiplied. By the 3rd century AD, Rome entered near-continuous instability. Civil wars erupted constantly, frontiers collapsed repeatedly. Emperors rose and died with absurd speed. For soldiers, it meant endless exhaustion. Imagine serving during the crisis of the 3rd century, one emperor today, another next month. Barbarian invasions everywhere, plague spreading through camps, supply systems failing, entire regions collapsing into chaos. The empire itself began to resemble a traumatized organism, and soldiers absorbed the worst of it. Late Roman armies increasingly relied on recruits from impoverished backgrounds or frontier populations. Discipline deteriorated in some areas. Veterans often received inadequate compensation or land. Many simply became wandering armed men in a collapsing world. There is something deeply haunting about the final centuries of Rome, because you can almost feel collective fatigue settling over the empire like winter fog. Everyone seems tired. The civilians, the emperors, the soldiers most of all. Imagine a veteran returning home around the 4th century AD. The old certainties are gone. Taxes crushing communities, corruption everywhere, frontier raids increasing, religious tensions dividing cities, inflation destroying savings. And inside his own mind lingered decades of violence. Rome still praised military glory publicly, of course. Empires always do. Statues remained, triumphs continued, speeches celebrated courage and sacrifice. But behind the ceremonies stood countless broken men trying unsuccessfully to become ordinary again. Some sought comfort in religion. Mystery cults gained popularity among soldiers, partly because traditional Roman religion often felt emotionally distant. Christianity later spread rapidly through military communities as well. The promise of forgiveness, peace, eternal rest, these ideas resonated deeply in violent times. A soldier who had killed repeatedly might desperately crave spiritual cleansing. Others turned toward brotherhood. Veterans frequently maintained close ties with former comrades because only fellow soldiers understood the psychological weight they carried. And many simply endured quietly. That may be the most haunting aspect of all. Most traumatized Roman veterans probably never spoke openly about their suffering. They kept farming, kept drinking, kept waking from nightmares, kept staring silently into fires, while families avoided asking questions. History remembers Rome as confident and invincible, but beneath the marble existed oceans of private grief. Sometimes, ancient texts accidentally reveal this grief in small moments. A letter home from a distant soldier begging for warmer clothing. An epitaph written by parents mourning a son who survived war only to die afterward. A veteran dedicating offerings to gods for surviving impossible odds. Tiny human fragments surviving inside enormous historical machinery. And perhaps that is why Roman military history still feels strangely modern despite the centuries separating us. Because underneath the helmets and Latin inscriptions were human beings navigating experiences our nervous systems still struggle to survive today. Fear, violence, loss, alienation, the unbearable weirdness of returning home after witnessing too much. Modern psychology has given us terms like PTSD, survivor's guilt, hypervigilance, moral injury. Rome had none of these words. Yet Roman veterans almost certainly experienced all these realities, especially moral injury. That quiet devastation that emerges not merely from danger, but from participating in acts that violate one's sense of humanity. Roman warfare demanded brutality. Entire towns massacred, prisoners enslaved, rebellions crushed publicly through terror. Soldiers participated because refusal was impossible. But memory does not disappear simply because authority approved the violence. Some veterans likely carried unbearable guilt beneath their discipline. Others numbed themselves emotionally until little remained except routine and rage. And society rewarded this numbness because effective soldiers required emotional suppression. The empire depended on men who could kill effectively without collapsing psychologically afterward. A difficult business model, if we're being honest, especially over centuries. There are accounts from Roman history of veterans becoming startlingly detached from ordinary suffering. Men laughing during executions, crowds treating gladiatorial bloodshed as entertainment. Public violence normalized everywhere. Now, Roman culture was already quite enthusiastic about brutality before military service entered the picture. This was a civilization where political disagreements occasionally escalated into organized massacres. So perhaps we should avoid pretending everyone started as emotionally delicate philosophers. Still, prolonged warfare amplified existing hardness. When violence becomes routine, empathy often erodes quietly. And empires require this erosion to function. Consider the Roman triumph, that grand ceremonial parade celebrating military victory. Victorious generals rode through Rome while crowds cheered and prisoners marched toward execution. Loot glittered beneath sunlight. Musicians played. Citizens celebrated conquest like a festival. But somewhere in the marching columns were ordinary soldiers carrying invisible wounds, already beginning to shape the rest of their lives. The triumph lasted a day. The memories lasted forever. Ancient historians rarely centered the emotional lives of common soldiers, because elite writers considered such topics unimportant. Yet occasionally empathy slips through. Tacitus, writing about campaigns in Germania, describes troops emotionally shattered by ambushes and catastrophic losses. Men became fearful of forests, terrified of shadows, consumed by panic. Some reportedly refused orders from sheer psychological exhaustion. Even Rome's legendary discipline had limits. And once broken, soldiers were often discarded rather than healed. There were no rehabilitation programs, no counseling, no understanding that trauma alters brain chemistry. A veteran unable to function simply became someone else's problem, usually his family's. Imagine the wives of Roman soldiers. History rarely discusses them in detail, but they carried enormous burdens. Some waited decades during deployments with little information about whether husbands remained alive. Others suddenly found themselves living beside emotionally distant or volatile men, transformed by war. A returning legionary might barely recognize his own children. His children, meanwhile, might fear him. Ancient households were already authoritarian by modern standards. Add unresolved trauma, chronic pain, alcoholism, financial stress, and emotional isolation, and many veterans likely became frightening figures within their own homes. Not monsters necessarily, just damaged. And damage spreads. Children raised around traumatized parents often inherit fear without understanding its source. Entire communities shaped by generations of war veterans may gradually normalize emotional suppression and aggression. Rome built its empire through military expansion, but the psychological cost echoed far beyond battlefields. Even in death, soldiers carried traces of this burden. Roman tombstones frequently emphasize military service with extraordinary pride. Years served, battles fought, units commanded, decorations earned. Why? Partly because military identity consumed so much of a man's existence that little else remained. A veteran might spend more time with his legion than with his family. The army shaped his friendships, habits, worldview, speech, even posture. Without it, who was he? Retirement could create terrifying emptiness. Modern veterans sometimes describe missing combat, despite hating war itself. The intensity, the clarity, the brotherhood. Roman veterans probably experienced similar contradictions. Civilian life could feel unbearably slow after decades of survival-driven existence. A quiet farm in Umbria lacks the emotional intensity of charging into battle beside men who would die for you. And trauma complicates memory further. Human beings often remember danger with strange nostalgia once immediate fear fades, especially when ordinary life becomes disappointing. Some Roman veterans undoubtedly spent old age retelling campaign stories endlessly. Not merely from pride, but because war remained the defining emotional reality of their lives. Others refused to speak of it at all. Silence can be its own kind of monument. One especially tragic element of Roman military life involved recruitment age. Many soldiers entered service extremely young. Teenagers, essentially, brains still developing, identities still forming. Then Rome handed them shields and sent them into slaughterhouses. Young minds adapt quickly to violence because youth adapts quickly to everything. But adaptation carries costs. A boy recruited at 17 might spend the next 20 years learning that hesitation kills, emotional vulnerability invites punishment, and human life possesses frighteningly little value. Then suddenly he is 40 and expected to settle peacefully into village life. The transition borders on absurd, and yet countless veterans attempted it anyway because humans are stubborn creatures. They married, raised children, farmed land, opened taverns, worshipped gods, complained about taxes, tried imperfectly to become ordinary. Some even succeeded. History focuses heavily on suffering because suffering leaves dramatic traces. But many veterans probably carved out meaningful lives despite their wounds. Human resilience deserves acknowledgement too. Still, resilience is not the same thing as healing. Rome never truly healed its soldiers because Rome never understood them well enough to try. The empire viewed legionaries primarily as tools of stability and conquest, necessary instruments, replaceable resources. Even beloved emperors who cared about troop morale generally focused on effectiveness rather than emotional well-being. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-emperor himself, spent years campaigning along the Danube frontier during brutal wars. His private writings reveal exhaustion and melancholy beneath imperial dignity. He understood suffering intellectually, perhaps better than most rulers. Yet even he remained trapped inside Rome's military machine. An emperor could reflect philosophically on mortality while still ordering thousands into battle the next morning. That contradiction defines Rome beautifully. Civilization and brutality intertwined so tightly they became inseparable. The roads, aqueducts, laws, architecture, literature, all partially built atop traumatized bodies marching endlessly across continents. And maybe that is why Roman history still fascinates us late at night. Because Rome feels uncomfortably recognizable. A society celebrating military heroism while struggling to care for veterans afterward. Public admiration mixed with private neglect. Ceremonies replacing understanding. Empires change uniforms over time, but human psychology remains stubbornly similar. Somewhere tonight, even now, veterans around the world sit awake in dark rooms, unable to fully explain what war did to them. They may live thousands of years after Rome's collapse, but emotionally, the distance is smaller than we like to imagine. The Roman legionary waking from nightmares before dawn would understand them instantly. No translation required, and perhaps that realization should humble us slightly. For all our technology and modern sophistication, we still grapple with the same ancient problem: how to send human beings into organized violence without destroying pieces of them permanently. So far, history suggests no civilization has solved it. Not Rome, not anyone. Toward the empire's final centuries, the burden grew even heavier. Frontier pressures intensified. Entire communities were militarized, simply to hold collapsing borders together. Veterans no longer returned to triumphant stability. They returned to decay. Cities shrinking, economies failing, roads deteriorating, authority fragmenting. The empire that had once promised order increasingly delivered anxiety instead. Imagine surviving 20 years on the frontier, only to discover your homeland unraveling anyway. All that sacrifice for this? Late Roman writers described pervasive exhaustion throughout society. Soldiers mutinied more frequently, desertion increased, loyalty weakened. Not because individuals suddenly became morally inferior, but because chronic instability drains human beings psychologically. Empires, like people, can burn out, and Roman soldiers stood closest to the fire. There is one final irony worth considering tonight. Rome's military system was astonishingly effective in many ways. It conquered enormous territories and maintained power for centuries. Strategically, administratively, logistically, it worked. But psychologically, it consumed its own people continuously. Victory often required emotional mutilation on an industrial scale. And the empire normalized this sacrifice so thoroughly that many soldiers probably believed their suffering simply represented the natural price of manhood itself. That idea persisted long after Rome vanished. In many places, it still survives. The expectation that real men absorb trauma silently. That fear should remain hidden. That emotional pain somehow matters less than physical wounds. Roman veterans lived inside that silence. Some carved their names into stone, hoping not to disappear entirely. Others faded anonymously into villages and farms, carrying invisible wars within them until death finally granted rest. And death came often. Ancient life expectancy was already short. Veterans burdened by injuries, stress, alcoholism, or poverty likely died younger still. Some probably welcomed it. Not dramatically, not poetically, just tired. Very tired. If you could walk through a Roman cemetery at dusk and speak honestly with the dead, I suspect many soldiers would not talk first about glory or conquest. They would speak about weather on distant frontiers, about missing home, about friends buried beside roads no one remembers now, about fear, and maybe about relief. Relief that the marching eventually stopped. Because Roman military life was marching above all else. Endless roads stretching toward new wars, boots grinding into mud, packs biting into shoulders, standards swaying against gray skies. Always another horizon, always another campaign. And somewhere along those roads, countless men slowly became strangers to themselves. Tonight, the ruins of Rome still stand scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Broken walls, empty forts, moss-covered stones beneath moonlight. Tourists wander through them taking photographs, while guides discuss emperors and architecture. But sometimes, if you linger quietly enough near an old Roman frontier fort, especially in winter, it becomes easier to imagine the ordinary soldiers who once waited there. Cold, homesick, exhausted beyond language. Men staring into campfires while rain tapped softly against leather tents. Men wondering whether they would ever see Italy again. Men pretending bravery because everyone else was pretending too. And eventually, the lucky ones went home. Broken perhaps, but alive, which in Rome often counted as victory. The old veteran from our opening scene eventually rises before sunrise. His joints ache in the cold. Outside, fog drifts slowly over empty fields. Somewhere distant, a dog barks once and falls silent. He steps outside alone. The world is peaceful now. No marching armies, no screaming cavalry, no centurions shouting orders through smoke and chaos. Only morning birds and wet grass. Yet his body remains tense anyway. Because war does not always end when the fighting stops. Sometimes it settles quietly into the nervous system and waits there for years. The veteran looks toward the horizon, where dawn slowly brightens the sky over Italy. Perhaps he remembers comrades long dead. Perhaps he remembers battles he wishes he could forget. Perhaps he remembers nothing clearly at all anymore. Only feelings drifting like ghosts through the dark. Fear, grief, survival. He breathes the cold morning air and listens to the silence. For a moment, there is no empire, no glory, no Rome. Only an aging man standing beneath a waking sky, trying to live with the things he has seen. And slowly, gently, the sun rises anyway.